So I thought I'd throw up a video here regarding a fairly contentious issue in sort of modern culture, which is the ongoing debate between um, Christian theology, particularly, I guess, and science, or the broadly speaking, the issue between faith and science. And there's a few irons in the fire when it kind of comes to that particular debate. There's a few popular ideas that's often referred to or drawn into the calculations when these two kind of views kind of come together or debated. And I thought I'd probably pay attention to some of those issues here. And I'd start by making some preliminary remarks about some of the ways the church actually has invested in science, invested in education, particularly in the Middle Ages. Um, and I suppose that would shed some sort of curiosity over the view that the church is either anti-science or anti-education. And then I'll move to some remarks about one of the big players that's often used, which is the Galileo ecclesiastical court trial, and that's often used. Excuse me. That's often used as a kind of an instance or an occasion when the church was actually quite persecutory and oppressive and pushed back against science. And I'll address that a little bit later on. But just to begin with, sort of just to say that actually, contrary to popular belief, the church never actually supported the idea that the earth was flat. It never actually banned human dissection either. It never burned anyone at the stake for scientific ideas. I think for the last 100 years or so, the historic data has increasingly shown how sophisticated the science of the Middle Ages actually was. For example, it was in the Middle Ages that the compass, paper, printing, gunpowder were invented. Despite the biblical imagery that spoke of the earth being flat or having edges, medieval people knew that the Bible, medieval people knew where the Bible seemed to conflict with good sense or reason. Medieval thinkers were happy to interpret what Scripture was saying figuratively rather than literally. So, medieval Christians understood that not every phrase should be, read in a hyper literal sense. Likewise, despite a popular myth, almost everyone in the Middle Ages knew that the Earth was spherical, not flat. They did believe that the Earth was stationary and at the center of the universe. But this wasn't primarily based on biblical reasons. It was a prevalent belief among scholars in astronomy at the time. And much is made of the idea of the Earth being at the center of the universe as being a sign or a push by the church as an elevation of the Earth and humanity above the rest of creation. But in actual fact, Earth's position at the center of the universe was seen as something of baseness. Jewish philosophers and the Catholic philosopher and theologians, St. Thomas Aquinas, spoke of the Earth's location as a sign of lowliness, not elevation, and being at the center was akin to being at the bottom. And it's moving on to one of the most important sort of developments in human history, was that of the sort of university system. And it actually developed with the active support of the papacy. About 30% of the medieval university curriculum covered subjects and texts concerned with the natural world. The proliferation of universities between 1200 and 1500 meant that hundreds and thousands of students, about 250,000 in the German universities alone, from 1350 on, were exposed to science in the Greco-Arabic tradition. Large numbers of students studied geometry, optics, the rudiments of astronomy. And even students who didn't complete their degree gained elementary understandings with natural philosophy and mathematical sciences. And the church actually supported all of this. And far from being the enemy of philosophy and science, the Church of the Middle Ages was an enormous benefactor of universities. The Catholic Church gave more financial and social support to the study of astronomy for over 6 centuries, from recovery of ancient learning during the late Middle Ages into the Enlightenment, and it gave more than any other institution at the time. So turning to the most frequently cited example of the conflict between church and science, it's the case of Galileo and his conviction by ecclesiastical court for teaching Copernicus's heliocentric view of the universe. Well, as it turns out, as most things are, the matter is much more complex than the one-sided perspective that's often presented. Nicholas Copernicus was actually a Polish priest. He was a Polish Catholic priest, and he presented an argument for the sun being at the center of the universe and being orbited by the Earth and the other planets. And this theory was known as heliocentrism. And cardinals of the church encouraged him to publish the concept and even dedicated it to Pope Paul III. Despite the support, however, of the Catholic hierarchy, the work didn't gain wide acceptance because almost no scientists at the time were convinced of this, because almost all of the observable data at the time spoke against this theory. It's also worth saying that Copernicus's views about heliocentrism were known for decades before he even published his work. And he was never censured, and he was never interrogated by the church. When Galileo advocated for geocentrism, the simplistic and ultimately inaccurate narrative in modern culture is that Galileo proved that the Earth moves around the sun, and the church imprisoned him as a heretic because his views conflicted with Scripture. The real story is actually much more complicated. Galileo was from the Tuscany region of Italy during the time of the Medici family's rule, and one of the Medici's grand daughters, I think, the Grand Duchess Christina, had inquired whether the heliocentric idea contradicted sacred scripture. Galileo insisted that scripture's representation should be the default view unless and until the contrary view can be proved with certainty. And in this case, Galileo's views here are theologically sound from a Catholic perspective. Pope Urban VIII was fascinated by the topic, and he and Galileo had 6 private audiences over the course of several days, during which they discussed the matter. And the Pope even gave Galileo permission to write about heliocentrism, with the qualification that the argument, the theory, would be treated hypothetically, and that geocentrism argument should be included in the book, including another theory which the Pope himself had thought up. And Galileo agreed. So in 1632, a year before the ecclesiastical court, Galileo published this book under the title A Dialogue on the 2 Chief World Systems. But as it turned out, the actual style of the book came out as an attack against the prevailing view of geocentrism in favor of heliocentrism. Galileo omitted any reference to the strongest competitor for geocentrism, and the dialogue itself was not representative of the best thinking in science at the time. The title of the book suggests that there was a dialogue between characters, made-up characters, and in the book, one character was acting as a neutral questioner. He was named Sagredo. Another character was supporting the Copernican model, and his name was Salviati. And finally, the proponent of geocentrism, he was named Simplicio, which is Italian for simpleton. And it was in Simplicio's mouth that the Pope's own argument was placed, which by implication was calling the Pope a dunce, an idiot. And the Pope, who had supported and encouraged him, was actually made out to look like a fool in this particular publication. Now, you can debate the wisdom of that choice, but that's the reality of what Galileo did. So upon hearing this, the Pope felt betrayed, and he had not been aware of what the content of what he had not been aware of what was going to be written in the book. And he also felt manipulated, since Galileo had not mentioned what he was going to do, and being felt deceived, Pope Urban VIII took umbrage and thus allowed a formal trial to commence. But in the hearing, in the hearing before the trial, there was discrepancies in documentation. There were alleged different documents, and there was not corresponding evidences. So ultimately, Galileo claimed that he thought the book was neutral and did not actually defend heliocentrism per se. And the tribunal therefore agreed to a plea bargain that would simply involve Galileo recanting what he had said, and he would immediately have been acquitted. However, the pontiff at the time was deeply affronted, and he made an agreement for the trial to ensue. And despite popular belief, Galileo was never actually tortured, and neither had been imprisoned. In fact, he stayed in the ambassador of Tuscany's embassy's palace during the trial. Galileo was sentenced to house arrest, but he was afforded every convenience, including a servant, as he resided in his Tuscan villa, and he was permitted to continue scientific research, where he actually wrote his greatest contribution to science, namely a book on mechanics and gravity, while he was under that house arrest. It is the case that Galileo, the incident was actually more to do with the egos of two particular individuals, and less to do with any theological effrontery or scientific effrontery. It was more to do with one person feeling deceived by another and acting out of that in a mean-spirited way, and seeking revenge, I guess you could say. So in the commission inaugurated by St. Pope John Paul II in 1992, the commission officially apologized for the way the church had actually handled the whole affair. But what's interesting to note is that Galileo is often cited because it is uniquely singular. It's not commonplace at all in the life of the church in the Middle Ages at all to have enacted in this way towards science or scientists. So when we think about that, when we think about the Galileo incident, remember that as it is recorded in history and increasingly known, that this was a dispute between two men over ideas and over pride, essentially. Not to do with any theological pushback against scientific thinking or exploration. So I think I'll leave it at that, and hopefully that's given some food for thought, and hopefully maybe we can think more on this faith and science debate in videos ahead. Bye for now.